first one that we mentioned, being in prayer. It's not only the start of how we extend Christ into relationships, it has to go through the entire process of living out our lives before people. And then we spent a couple weeks talking about listening with compassion. You know, too often we're willing to share and use our mouth, but we're not willing to open our ears. And to genuinely share compassion is to listen to where people are at and what's going on in their life and be genuinely concerned about them. And then the last 2 weeks we talked about eating with others. And we used the example of Jesus with the disciples and different times through Scripture that eating was important. And then we talked about how do we make that happen. Last Sunday morning after the worship service, there was a group that you heard. Joey got up and he says, hey, anybody that wants to come, we're going to go out and eat. We've got a picture of that. And so this is the group that went out to eat last Sunday. And Joey posted on Facebook how encouraging it was. There were some people that they hadn't really gotten to know, and they sat around that table and they shared a meal together. Eating together is such an important aspect of reaching out and extending Christ to others. Well, that brings us to the fourth in the series. So B-L-E-S. The first S that we're going to look at is serving in love. Serving in love. And we can see this throughout the entirety of Jesus' ministry. We look at time after time in his ministry, and he served others out of his love. I want you to turn to the passage that was read earlier, John 13. This is one of the key passages where servanthood is seen in Jesus' ministry. Again, this is right before he's going to go to the cross. They're celebrating Passover meal, and we talked about that a few weeks ago, and we had communion, and we talked about what does it mean to celebrate communion as a group, and it was part of that meal that they shared over Passover. And you know, when you sit down at a meal, the first thing that you do right now is you go and you wash your hands, right? In fact, we should be washing our hands many times throughout the day, but anytime you sit down and you're going to eat, you want to make sure you wash your hands. Well, watch what happens in this passage. Starting with verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. So they were all sitting around the table. He laid aside his outer garments, and he took a towel and tied it around his waist. Now, what's about to happen here is amazing, and we're going to dig into why. In this passage, what happens is Jesus gets up from the table and says, there's something that hasn't been done yet. And what would happen was they'd come in from the road, and their shoes were open. They were sandals, or they were open-toed shoes that they'd walking on these roads, and these roads are dusty. It's not like our current roads. And they would come into a meal, and someone that was the host would always provide someone there to wash the feet of the guests, because they would be clean for the meal then. Maybe because they didn't want to smell stinky feet under the table the whole time that they were eating, but they would provide someone. In this case, they get to the meal and they're all sitting down at the table, but no one has washed anyone's feet. And Jesus looks around, and he gets up, takes off his outer clothing, and he wraps himself in a towel, and he goes from person to person. Look at what happens next. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Wow. Jesus gets up and does the most menial task, the task that a servant would do in a home. In fact, if there was no servant, it was supposed to be the lowest person in that room. The most insignificant person in the room would get up and do the job. Or, at the very least, every person would take care of their own feet. But do you understand what's taking place here? It's more than just a foot washing service or washing of hands like we do today. The washing of feet was intentionally used by Jesus as a way to teach them the importance of servanthood. Jesus led the way for others by serving them. He lived out a perfect example for us of what it means to bless others by serving them in love. Interestingly, Jesus did not serve those who were worthy like a servant would. Normally you come into a home and the lowest person or the servant would take care of everyone that was above them on the status. But Jesus didn't just wash the feet of those that were worthy. In fact, he washed the feet of everyone that was there, including his enemy. And his enemy was sitting at the table with him. And who is that? That's Judas Iscariot. And we're told that Judas was already prepared to go and turn Jesus over to the Romans. Turn Jesus over to be going to trial. And so Jesus doesn't just choose who he's going to serve, but he goes around the table one at a time and he washes all of their feet. You get the famous quote in there from Simon Peter about, hey, don't wash my feet. And Jesus, says, if I don't wash your feet, you can have no part of me. Jesus, after he's done, he sits back down and says, when he had washed their feet, he put on his outer garments and he resumed his place and said to them, do you understand what I've done for you? How is this possible? How was it that Jesus, the one that was the person of honor at that table, got up and did the most menial task? I'm thinking about that and I'm going, doesn't that discredit him in front of people? He's the leader. Somebody should have been washing his feet. In the kingdom of God, the master humbles himself and takes the place of a servant. Maybe Jesus was on to something here. You think so? Today, there's a buzz phrase that goes around, and it's called servant leadership. It's not just in churches either. Businesses are actually using this as a way to encourage leaders in their role as a leader. Servant leadership. Everywhere you look, people are talking about it, they're writing about it. Lead by serving. One of the books on leadership that I was able to actually hear the author speak at a conference by Crawford Loritz. Dr. Crawford Loritz is a pastor in Georgia, Roswell, Georgia. The title of his book is Leadership as an Identity. Listen to what he has to say about servant leadership. I don't want to sound cynical, but some of what people mean by servant leadership is not the same thing as what the Bible teaches distinctly Christian leaders to do. Sometimes the expression is used in a utilitarian way. In other words, we need to be careful that we're not using servant leadership language as a strategy, as a means to manipulate people to do what we want them to do. To be sure, as leaders, we want people whom we lead to be productive and effective in accomplishing the goal and the assignment, but certainly we want to create environments for them to maintain effectiveness. But he goes on and he says, but it cannot be a manipulation tactic to get what we want. Sometimes that's why we serve. If I serve you and do this, then I know that I'm going to get this. Kids, that's why they do chores, right? Because I'm going to get that money at the end of the week, or I get to go to get that special treat. But that's not what servant leadership is. He goes on and he says this, what is the answer? I believe the key is embracing servant leadership is not a strategy, but it is an identity. It's not something you do, but it is who you are. He goes on and he talks about what it means to be that servant leader. So where does that servant leadership come from? If it's an identity, if it's who we are, how do we become that? How does our servanthood become part of our identity? How do we develop a heart to serve others in love? He goes on in that chapter of that book, the entire chapter is on something called humility. Now, humility is a quality that undergirds everything about serving in love. And while we talk about servant leadership, even in our world around us, humility is something that's rarely seen in our leaders. I mean, could you imagine the principal of your school washing all of your feet when you came into school? No. Could you imagine somebody that is the owner of a company coming and taking everyone's coat off as they came in, hanging it up for them, sharpening their pencils, whatever it is that they would do? Can you imagine those that are leading our country coming down and serving? See, humility is what undergirds true servanthood. In Jesus' time, leaders were to be honored and respected. Leaders were to be served. Therefore, if you aspire to a place of honor, you should be served, right? Well, in Mark 10, there's a situation that pops up with the disciples. In Mark 10, two disciples step up and say, "We want something special, Jesus." James and John, and they pull Jesus aside, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Whoa, that's pretty bold. Jesus says, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And they said, we want you to grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in glory. In other words, they knew that Jesus said he was going to be reigning in a kingdom. And they said, "We want to be your left and right guys in the kingdom." Can you imagine the rest of the other 10 disciples at that moment when they're hearing these guys ask this? Talk about creating a tense environment. Jesus comes back to them in his whole dialogue of what has happened, but he said, "You know what? In order for you to be a leader, you must be a servant." He says to them, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." See, the entire focus of the book of Mark comes in under this verse. The purpose that Jesus came was to serve. It's the whole theme of the book of Mark. The Son of Man came not to serve, but not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. See, Jesus is the master who humbled himself and served in love. The Apostle Paul has a great summary of what this looks like in the book of Philippians. We're going to look at this a little bit today and again next week. In Philippians chapter 2, he says this, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross." You can't get much more humble than hanging on a cross. The humiliation of the cross is the ultimate expression of what it meant for Jesus to serve. Talked about this a little bit last week. We have this barrier between us and God called sin. The penalty of sin is death. Whoever sins has to die. The problem is if I die, I'm separated from God forever. The greatest expression of servanthood was for Jesus to go to the cross on our behalf. He took the lowest place possible by dying the death of a sinner. And he did that for us. It's amazing, back in Mark, when they talk about Jesus' crucifixion, Mark chapter 15, After he's mocked, after he's crucified, after he is dying on the cross, it says that when he died, there was someone that was standing at the base of his cross. He was a centurion. And his statement is, truly this was the Son of God. When he saw Jesus die the way that he died, it was proof to this Roman guard that Jesus was who he said he was. Back in John, back at the table, Jesus uses this as a teachable moment. He sits down at the table and he says, "Do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done. Truly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I've given you example that you should do what I do." Jesus turns the selfless act of washing the disciples' feet into a teachable moment about what they were supposed to become as his followers. Some of you may be familiar with the name Ken Blanchard. Ken Blanchard is very famous for a book that came out. It was called The 1 Minute Manager. Anybody familiar with that? 1 Minute Manager was a book that took businesses by storm. Shortly after writing that book, Ken Blanchard came to a personal faith in Jesus Christ. He's got another book that's a great small book. He writes these little bitty books that are so pointed. This one's called The Servant Leader. Listen to what he says in the beginning of this book. Jesus' instructions to his first disciples on how they were to lead sent a clear message to all of those who follow him that leadership was first and foremost an act of service. There was no plan B. He placed no restrictions or limitations of time, place, or situation that would allow us to exempt ourselves from the command. For a follower of Jesus, servant leadership isn't just an option, it is a mandate. Often we want to receive salvation. We want to have that relationship with God, but we don't want to follow what he says. And our ego gets up in our face, or we start to bristle when he says things like, exercise hospitality, or serve as I am served, or by this will all men know that you're my disciples, by your love for one another. See, we want to receive. We want to be served, but we don't want to serve. Simply put, those who follow the Master serve others in love. How do you know you're a follower of Jesus Christ? One of the things that people should see in our lives is a servant's heart. Not out of compulsion, not out of obligation, not out of I'm being paid to do this, but out of love. So how do we live out the reality of God's kingdom? By humbly serving others in love. The Apostle Paul in that chapter of Philippians gives us some of the keys to what that looks like. So Philippians chapter 2. Remember, we just had read that Jesus' example was to empty himself, to go to the cross, and to die that death. At the beginning of that chapter, he says this: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not look only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Do nothing from selfishness. For me, consider others as significant. See, when we view others from God's perspective, it changes how we respond to other people. We become willing to serve them because He served us. The greatest display of compassion was when Jesus went and died on the cross. I had the privilege of conducting a funeral yesterday. And some of you know Tom Mold's father passed away, and I was able to do the funeral. And when Tom spoke about his dad, he says, I've not met someone that is more giving than my dad was. Can we live to that level? Let me give you some areas of life that God can use mightily if we're willing to give them over to Him for His glory. Crawford Loritz uses another illustration in his book. He talks about his mother. And he says, Mom used to tell us all the time, don't hold on to stuff so tightly that God can't bless you with anything else. See, there's three things that in our life that we need to be able to turn over if we're going to be servants. The first is treasures, gifts, the things that are valuable to us. Think about that for yourself. What are the things that you value the most right now? The possessions, the objects. You got something in mind? How tightly are you holding on to that object? If somebody else needed that, if it was able to meet their need, would you open your hand and freely give it? Maybe for some of us, it's our fishing equipment. Yeah. Ouch. When I go out in my boat, one of the things that I do is I've got a whole lot of fishing poles. And when I like to take people out to go fishing with me. And when I go take them fishing, I say, hey, those are the poles over here. Look at that. You don't have a pole? No problem. Use one of these poles. But I've got about 3 poles that I'm not very quick to let people use. They're expensive. Not only that, they're the ones I catch fish on. Sometimes I hold on too tightly to my treasures. Secondly, talents. Talents are the things that you do well. All of us have them. Things that you do well. Some of those are spiritual gifts that we're given as believers. Some of them are natural talents that we have. You're just really good at it. One of the things I do is I coach track in the spring. And when you see the athletes come out, you can tell which athletes have a natural bent toward running. And you can tell which ones don't. I was one of those that didn't. I had to work at running, and even then I was just average. But when you see somebody come out and they have a talent and it shines, that's because God gave it to them. Whether or not they recognize it, it's because God gave them that talent. How are you opening your hand with your talents so that God can use them for His glory? So treasures, talents, and the last one is our time. If you only made time available, what is it that you could do to serve others? See, we all have abilities, not just talents, but abilities. Maybe you have the ability to use a rake and rake leaves. Please come over to my house. Now that the snow has melted and the leaves after last night with the wind, they're all down. You know, maybe you've got an ability and you can put out some time. I know of a couple of people in this church that have taken time to serve. They sketched out days to help people. And I am so blessed by that. Let me share with you just a couple of ways that I have heard about people from our own CrossPoint family that are serving others in love. Would you like to hear a couple pointed ones of our own people. One is from a family that when COVID started and they were locked into their apartment and their apartment complex, they said, well, what can we do? We're stuck in here. And they'd started to build relationships with a few of their neighbors, but they wanted to expand on that. So they knew some of their neighbors were going to really be struggling getting food or getting meals prepared or whatever else. So throughout the week, they would notify their neighbors, I'm cooking for you tonight. All you need to do is stop by and we'll have it ready and you can take it. And they had neighbor after neighbor that took them up on that. And they blessed by giving out of what they had. That's a cool story. Another cool story happened this week. One of our CrossPointers posted on our Facebook group page. I put out there about eating, and I said, let's brainstorm. I had a lot of people like it, but not anybody brainstormed. You know, my 4 things that I put out there were about the only thing that were on there, except for someone that responded, and they said, I don't know if this is eating or not. And I responded and said, no, it's not eating. You're getting ahead of the ball game because you're talking about serving. Listen to what they said. I was thinking of tying up little flyers and putting them in my neighbors' mailboxes that said, help your neighbor this winter. Would you be willing to be on a list of neighbors that would be willing to shovel, run errands, pick up groceries for another neighbor? If so, let me know by November 15th, and I'll put you on our list. Then I'll email the entire neighborhood, and ask them to reach out this winter if they could use help in any of those things. And I would find a neighbor volunteer to help. Most of all, encouraging neighbors to connect with others. Wow. See, not only are they going and doing something, they're involving others. The talent they have of getting other people on board. You know, if we are going to be followers of Jesus Christ, he says, you will be a servant of all. So what about you? Are you willing to call Jesus teacher and Lord? That's what he said to the disciples. He says, you all call me teacher and Lord, and I'm serving you. Are you willing to follow Jesus' example of service? Will you hold loosely to your treasures, your talents, and your time so that he can be glorified with the ways that he's blessed you? I ask the worship team to come back up, and as they're coming, next week we have a unique opportunity to actually serve. Now, I'm not going to have everybody get in their car and go with me, and we're not going to go clean the toilets down at the local gas station. But what I want you to do is this. Last week you heard about something that we're going to be doing next week, the Compassion Project. It's an opportunity for you to use your treasures, your time, and possibly even your talents to make an impact on children in the world that are needy. You're going to have an opportunity to do that when we bring that to you next week. Last week, Jessica Bird shared about it. We're going to present it in full next Sunday. We're also going to be taking a step away from this series for one Sunday and talking about what is compassion in our church when our world needs it desperately, especially this week. What is compassion as believers? When we were getting ready, Missy shared with me that she had a story about Compassion International when she was serving overseas. And she had a real story about it, and I want her to share as they start to lead us in worship.
So as Mike shared, I was with Youth Mission in Thailand, and we were working with orphanages, and a lot of those kids were sponsored by Compassion. And it was so fun to see all the pictures, all the stories, and to hear them talk about their sponsors. One girl in particular that we were chatting with, she was in her teenage years, and she was sharing that she was going to university, which was huge for these kids in this area. And she shared that because of Compassion, of being sponsored as a young child, through the years she was able to save some of that money and to be able to purchase a moped, which gave her the transportation to be able to go to college. message. And so because of people like you and I, lives are being changed around the world. And so I just am super excited for next week to hear more, to see how God is going to use that in our congregation. And so looking forward to hearing more about compassion next week. As we continue here in our worship this morning, just listening this morning of acting in that service is that act of laying down our lives for our fellow believers, for those who are unsaved, is what Christ did for us. And so as we sing this morning, feel free to stand, join us online. We're going to sing about that, of what it is to surrender our lives to the Lord. So please join us.
Here's my life, I lay it down. you catch that? Nothing can snatch me from Jesus. That's all we need to know. Nothing can take us. A couple of reminders for you. Our annual meeting is coming up Saturday, November 14th at 9 o'clock. You can meet us here in person or online. If you would like a copy of the annual report, for those of you who are here, they're right out that door. And if you're online and you'd like an electronic copy, just contact the office and we'll get that out for you. Loving one another and serving one another. Sometimes it's really not that hard. Sometimes it's really easy things, like wearing a mask. We can serve each other, we can love each other through protecting each other by wearing our masks. And that is something that the governor's asked us to do, that's something our elders have asked us to do. So as you come into the building, whether that's on Sunday or another time, please do be wearing your masks. And this week, find somebody, maybe somebody who's difficult to serve, and serve them. Not through your power, but through Jesus' power. Through his love. Let it flow through you, fill you, flow through you, out to a very hurting world. Go in his peace and serve him with joy. Thanks.